This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence, and in this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to a small number of coaches who specifically focus on coaching men. We are aware that many men are struggling with their lives, their sense of meaning and purpose, their relationships, finances, physical and mental health and well-being. You'll hear from some of those who share their own life-changing stories, why coaching men matters, the various approaches they use, and the impact they are having. In this first episode of the series on coaching men, my guest is Will Johnson, a former finance director who transitioned from a conventional corporate career to working full-time in men's personal development. In our conversation today, you'll hear about Will's experience of burnout, and how that experience led to a transformative retreat with the Centre for Courage and Renewal, inspiring him to become a facilitator and coach. We also explore how Will's interests in poetry, mythology and imagery help men access a level of deeper self-awareness. We'll also explore his Circle of Trust retreats and the importance of and the challenges for men asking for help. So Will, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rob. It's great to be here. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited about our chat today. We had a great chat a few weeks ago in preparation for our chat today. So there's lots we can cover, but perhaps we could just start with a brief introduction as to what you do today and perhaps a little bit of the backstory in terms of how you arrived at what it is that you do today, Will.
Yeah, for sure. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm working one-to-one with individuals. I established this sort of identity, if you like, called the Will Johnson journey, which on the one hand sounds quite cheesy, but in the other way, it sort of really does describe exactly how I feel about this chapter of life. And it seems to resonate with others as well, this sense of journey and adventure. So I've been doing that, actually, funnily enough, full time, almost 2 years. But it's been much longer than that in terms of doing things on the side, growing things gently. And so working one-to-one with folks, but also running what's called Circles of Trust retreats, which we may well get a chance to talk about. It's a particular way of gathering folks together based on some ways of working developed by the Centre for Courage and Renewal. So that's a particular passion of mine. And I guess the journey to that point was far more conventional. Left school, struggled at school, didn't really like the academic side, but got into uni to study accountancy, and 20 odd years later, climbed my way up the accountancy ladder, which got me to about 2019. And I was in a fairly senior role, pretty busy, and just completely ran out of energy. I describe it as having a burnout. It's the only way I can sort of simply describe it. But I really had just lost my spark, my energy, my fire. And it was quite interesting because my doctor signed me off for 2 weeks sick leave. And it was the same 2 weeks that I was due to be on a retreat in Ireland with the Centre for Courage and Renewal. And I remember saying to my wife at the time, Sarah, I said, I'm not sure I'm allowed to go on this retreat, am I? Shouldn't I be staying at home and resting in bed? And she said, you can do self-care whilst you're recovering. So I took myself off to Donegal on the Irish coast and spent a handful of days up there, and something just shifted. I found some peace and calm amongst a pretty stormy period of life. And at the end of that retreat, I'd heard that there was some space on this facilitator preparation program with the Centre for Courage and Renewal. And it was starting 2 weeks later. And I leapt at it and said, okay, this is for me. This is my call to adventure. Since then, I've just been gently developing and understanding how this all fits in to this chapter of life, really.
Yeah, so it sounds like that was a bit of a turning point for you. And I'm curious that in terms of what you went through when you made that decision to go and what changed for you, if you can summarize it, what was the big shift that you felt or the big insight or aha moment that you had, Will, that changed your thinking as a man, perhaps?
One of the big turning points was prior to going on that retreat, I'd plucked up the courage to phone my employer assistance hotline. Those numbers that get printed on leaflets and handed out.
I know the ones, yeah.
I'd probably contemplated calling it several times, but for some reason on this particular day, I decided I'm just going to call up and see what this has to offer. And I can remember the room that I was in when I made that phone call. One of the questions I had at the time is this really a legitimate thing to be calling up for? do I deserve to have support on the other end of the phone, or should I just get on with it? I think growing up, my role model, as many of us men, if we're lucky to have a father in the house, was my dad. And my dad would never have spoken about feelings. He would have just got on with it and gritted his teeth. And I suppose there was an inner voice in me saying, shouldn't you grit your teeth and get on with it? But I didn't. I phoned up. I think I was lucky enough to be given a handful of therapy sessions, counselling sessions. And I think that really did spark my journey towards finding a bit more of a peaceful chapter in life, really. And I think giving myself permission to find that calm, go inwards, find some inner truth about who I was and who I wanted to be and how I showed up. So yeah, there was something about having the courage to make that call and also giving myself permission that I deserved help.
Yeah, there's something there about the sense of agency, and to your point about giving ourselves permission and finding the courage to take action, which I respect that many, many men find that very, very hard to do. Whilst they may be courageous in many aspects of their life, they often find it hard, I believe, to find the courage to ask for help. Is that something that you see, Will, in the work that you do? And is that something you experienced yourself?
Definitely experienced it myself. I only ever talk from my direct experience with working with the men that I have and also with my own experience. But it is not uncommon in my experience for men to say something like, I'm not sure if this is worth talking about, but... And then the thing they go on to say is absolutely legitimate and absolutely worth talking about. And I think the minute that gets honoured and witnessed and not tried to be fixed too quickly and just to let it be part of the truth of that man's story, I think that can be a really big turning point as well. Just that sense of, yeah, it's okay to feel like this. I think that's why I quite like this way of working called circles of trust, because when I'm in a circle of trust, I can experiment with how I'm feeling. I can speak a little bit of my story out loud, hear it said and spoken, and then start to work with it. And oftentimes when I've spoken things out loud, it's the first time I've said it to myself.
Yeah, and that in itself can be quite powerful, just sort of hearing our own words or being able to articulate something that's been on the inside and actually now getting this out onto the outside. I'd love to get more into that. But before I do, you mentioned there the circles of trust, and I'm curious to learn more about that and what the context is there. I'm sure our listeners thinking the same thing. Tell me more about that, Will.
So circles of trust, developed by the Centre for Courage and Renewal. It's, in my mind, a very special, particular way of gathering groups together. I suppose in a circle of trust, what we're trying to do is reconnect folks with their inner voice, their inner source of truth, in a world where we don't often know not only who can we trust or what can we trust. I know at times I've questioned, can I still trust the voice inside me that's speaking? I remember my first experience of a circle of trust. I just left a leadership team meeting on the Friday. I'd driven, luckily, 20 minutes down the road in Cambridge, and I'm sat in a circle of people. And one of the first things that is read out is a poem. And it's almost like, for me, the world stopped moving for a few moments. And it was then that I realised just how busy my life had been, both as a finance director at the time, as a father to two young kids, a husband, trying to do the best job in that part of my life as well. And just for that brief moment of time, I was really able to take a deep breath and just feel into some of that emotion. And so circles of trust really, as I say, they've helped me connect to an inner source of truth that has then enabled me to speak some of that truth outside into the outer world. Oftentimes they come with a theme. I know the one in Ireland that I went to, which was very appropriately titled, was Staying Anchored, Moving with the Tide. So a beautiful paradox of when do we drop anchor? When do we lift up the anchor and let the tide take us? So, very evocative titles often.
There's so many ways I want to go with this, Will. It's great. I'm inspired by the way, what I know about you is that you use poetry, mythology and art in the work that you do. So I'm curious to learn more about that and how you use that perhaps as a provocation. But I think another question that I had a moment ago was thinking about your own experience when you phoned that hotline. And actually, on the one hand, what I heard is you had the courage to ask the question, just to say, don't think this is something that I can normally use this service for, but is it? I suppose that is having the courage to be curious, I suppose, about, okay, something's going on for me here. I need some support with that. So there's that going on. And then on the other hand, like with the circles of trust, as you're describing it there, you're being offered potentially opportunities that could trigger something.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to learn more about that, Will.
Reflecting in the moment, was it courage that got me to phone that line, or was it just became essential, I think?
Sort of run out of options type situation, do you mean?
Yeah, I think so.
Desperation.
I tried Headspace. I've done cold showers. I've done different things to try and get me back in my body, and something just wasn't landing. All of those things are great. I still use Headspace now, but there was something that was missing. And I think, phoning that number, getting some space really helped. Then it really was a sense of just following my intuition, not overthinking it. For all intents and purposes, following the Courage and Renewal approach didn't make sense on paper, but there was something that just led me in that direction. Yeah, poetry and myth and story and image. I hated poetry at school. It was just awful. I hated it. There was something intellectual about it. Read this poem by Wordsworth and tell me what it means in 2 paragraphs. And I think it really put me off. And I guess what I've learned through the way the Centre for Courage and Renewal really works is, and actually if you go into other realms like depth psychology, it speaks about this idea of metaphor and image and how the deep self often expresses itself through arts, through music. And so if I'm working with somebody and I might offer them a poem, there's a lovely poem by William Stafford which talks about there's a thread you follow, it goes amongst things that change, but it doesn't change. People will wonder what you're pursuing, but you don't ever let go of the thread. And if you say to a man, what's your thread? What's the thread that you'll never ever let go of? Or what's the thread that you have let go of? In some way that enables them to say, do you know what? I did let go of this part of my life and I need to get back hold of it. And it becomes slightly less scary. That's a poem by William Stafford. So I can say, through William Stafford's voice, I can borrow his voice to become more courageous with my own voice. And it just seems to work. And if somebody isn't a poetry person, then we can talk about a Greek myth, for example. There's a very famous myth of Homer's Odyssey and Odysseus trying to get home to his family. Odysseus spent 7 years in the story on an island with Calypso. It might be that I'd say to a man, do you feel like you've spent a long time stuck in one place? And they might resonate with that and say, you know what, I do feel really stuck. And I said, well, imagine yourself as Odysseus. He got off the island. There was something on that island that he needed to learn. And I don't know another way of getting to that level of depth without using these, what we call third things. If you're in a one-on-one relationship or a coaching session, that's lovely. But when we bring a third thing into the mix, suddenly there's a triangle and we can channel our shared energy through that third thing, which is what we do in circles of trust and men's gatherings. We all love a story.
Yeah. I'm really inspired by that, Will. I think sometimes in my experience of coaching, both as a coachee and as a coach, we sometimes bring third things in, perhaps even unconsciously, but to call it out and sort of bring that front and center is a really interesting insight, actually, Will, just to hear how we can intentionally bring a third thing into the conversation and it adds a new dynamic to the conversation. And what I was hearing there a moment ago is you talking about accessing the deep self. And this idea, it's a really powerful image for me, this idea of having a thread and our relationship to that thread, whether we've let go of that thread or if we're still following the thread, and almost perhaps being curious about what that thread even is for us. That in itself is a really powerful concept for me.
Yeah. And I think you could ask somebody, what colour's your thread? Oh, it's blue. What does blue evoke in you? It reminds me of the sea. I love the sea. And suddenly you're back into memories of the sea and how, I've not been to the sea for years. And then you get into some more soulful territory there and you think, what have I given away in the pursuit of all of this? What I really enjoy doing is being by the water. And, I think that's just an opportunity to connect with something that is, I happily use the word soul. I think soul is, for me, resonates, but it gets us in touch with something that is soulful and deep.
I know you've talked about shifting the masculine mind, and I'm curious to learn whether Is this what you're talking about, or is that something different?
Yeah, this is definitely it. It's interesting. I know we were talking just before we came on about this phrase, toxic masculinity. I had that phrase on my website. Hopefully what I do is the antidote to toxic masculinity. And I was talking to an individual in Canada who I would consider to be an elder of this work, working with men, a guy called Brian Braganza, who's a wonderfully soulful, experienced individual. And he said, I'm not sure I like the phrase toxic masculinity because it might suggest that all masculinity is toxic. He said he preferred shifting the masculine mind. And I thought, you know what? I like that. I think that's good. I think with a bit of distance, I look at that phrase now and think it's more than just shifting. It's enlarging, it's expanding the masculine mind so that I can be many things. I can be a provider. I can have a great, busy professional life. And at the weekends, I want to tend my garden. I want to read a poem. I'm all of these things. The poet Walt Whitman has a lovely phrase, which is, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. And I think we all contain multitudes, men and women and folk that don't identify as either. And the more we can enable us to tap into our multitudes, I think that for me is really powerful. So I think that's probably what I mean by shifting or expanding the masculine mind.
Yeah, I love that. Just coming back to your own story there with those thoughts in mind, and I appreciate we're always a work in progress. We're never a finished product in that sense. But I'm curious as to what sort of conclusions or perhaps early insights you may have reached now upon reflection of, I'm going back to that time where you made that call and that place you were in then. And I'm thinking about two things here. I'm thinking about your concept there with the thread and where you felt you were looking back from today in relation to that thread. But also, I'm just thinking about what you just said there in terms of the multitudes. And were there aspects of you that perhaps had been shut down or you'd kind of lost connection with? I'm thinking of the whole self here, and I'm imagining what it's like to be whole when we are well nourished in all aspects of our life. And I'm sort of thinking of the multitudes in that concept for myself here. But I'm curious as to how that shows up and resonates with you, Will.
Yeah, it really resonates for sure. I had this lovely job title of finance director, chartered accountant, finance director, and so much is projected onto a job title. I mean, it carries so much, accountant, good with numbers, successful, got there, got everything in order. And of course, that's just one way of looking at it. So I spent so many hours in an office, rarely had any energy to get out into nature. That was a massive part of my thread that I'd let go of, realizing that I spent most of my life in an office and was too exhausted when I got home to go out for a walk. Certainly that part of the thread was missing. I worked with one individual a couple of years ago, and the reason why he wanted to work with me wanted to work on himself, was that he'd become a very successful accountant. But his question was, but what else am I? I can't just be that. Together, we worked on reminding himself of the other things that he loved. He still loves his job. He's still working as a very senior finance professional, but he's got back into touch with 2 or 3 things that he just let go of. And suddenly his job isn't this huge thing that is controlling his whole solar system. The other things have got gravitational pull on his life, if you want to use that metaphor. And suddenly the solar system is suddenly more in balance. And I can certainly say that for my story as well.
You use an interesting word there about balance, and it's about having perhaps harmony as well between these things. And I love that idea of the sort of solar system and our relationship. It's interesting, isn't it? There are so many different ways that we can picture this stuff. And I think that maybe getting into that more creative visual aspect of the mind can help us to unlock some of the more emotional aspects that are going on for us, rather than just trying to approach it with logic, which I think is quite characteristic of men in many respects, is trying to logically solve a problem or come to some kind of solution.
I do think creativity is a massive part of my own healing journey, for sure. I didn't think I was creative. It's an old joke, but no one wants a creative accountant for a start. So when I started writing poems or being creative with designing retreats, which I love. It's like my happy place to design, which voices do we want to bring into this circle, which creative practices. So yeah, I think creativity is huge. I'm not also saying that we need perfect harmony either. I don't know that that's possible. I think sometimes just embracing the disharmony and knowing that that's okay is healthy. Knowing that in the same way that we take the solar system, the moon might be close one month and it might be further away the next, but it's all in motion. I think we are folks of motion as well. So that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, I remember a good friend of mine once said he was struggling to be able to combine two aspects of his life. And I think a coach and mentor of his said, well, just stop keeping them apart,
Yeah.
Literally, it was a letting go thing. Just let them be whatever they are and they'll find their own way of cohabiting, which I thought was a fascinating concept, because how often do we try and fuse two elements of our life together and make it work this way or make it that way? So I completely see your point there about what you're saying in terms of the disharmony. And I think there can be great power in that. Perhaps cultivating a sense of acceptance with the disharmony. And we were chatting off air just before this call with Maxine about suffering. And rather than trying to suppress that, perhaps work with it or try to learn more from it.
Yeah, 100%. I'm a huge advocate for, again, it's a psychological phrase, but follow the symptom. If you're feeling agitated, stay with it. That word that you use, cultivated, what can you cultivate out of this situation that you're in? Don't suppress it. There's a mythical story that I love. One of the key learnings from it is that what we exile grows hostile towards us. So if we're sensing anger or fear or even depression, if we try and avoid it, it will only get bigger, in my opinion, in my experience. Staying with it is really quite helpful. It's something that's turned up in my life that's here to teach me something.
Yeah, so that's a really powerful concept in itself. It's not an unfamiliar one in coaching, but I think it might be counterintuitive for a lot of men. And one of the things I appreciate is there are so many men in the world that don't realize that coaching is even a thing or it's even available to them, let alone unlocking any of this stuff that we're talking about today. But just on that theme there, Will, I'm fascinated by what you're saying in terms of the being with it, the staying with it, because I think for a lot of men, certainly initially, that might be quite a counterintuitive thing to do, because it might be that whether they were taught this or whether that's just perhaps how the world, society, culture, whatever. I mean, there's this expression, isn't there? Man up. It's that thing. And for me, that expression in itself is very much related to suppression, I feel. It's a case of burying these things down. And I would imagine for many men, after many years of experience in their life, they'll get to a stage where actually they're so habitually used to suppressing things that have been coming up for them that are unwanted. To be able to be with it and to follow it might feel quite counterintuitive to them. So I'm curious about the work that you do and how you've managed this for yourself, Will, in terms of the staying with it, the being with it. What sort of practices or approaches do you find are effective perhaps for you or others in terms of that? I guess on the one hand, having the courage to stay with it, but what else can help explore that uncomfortable space?
Yeah, there is something, I'll just say, whilst I'm thinking about that question, is I certainly felt like if I stayed with some of these negative feelings too long, that I would fall into some kind of depression and never get my way out of it. And I remember working with a therapist counsellor around it, and she was great, and she didn't always tell me things direct. And I was relaying a story of a family member, and she said, that's not going to happen to you. It's not predetermined that that's going to be your fate. And I thought that was really helpful to hear that as well. So I think having the courage to stay with something, again, this is about, I think, shifting the masculine mind to a certain extent of what is this symptom here to teach me? In mythology, there are always these characters known as threshold guardians. They're stopping me from stepping forward into a larger version of myself. It's an initiatory encounter. So if I have an experience of a particularly challenging work colleague, if I can reframe that as actually, this person's here as a kind of a threshold guardian that I need to learn something from. For me, it completely reframes it. It's less about my own weakness or some infallibility of my character. It's that actually this journey of life throws up these particular thresholds and I need to find a way around it. So I think that's one technique that I would certainly encourage people to see things less literally. I think. Deliteralize it.
Yeah.
Not everything needs to be fine point on. There's nuance. And then again, talking about the work for the Centre for Courage and Renewal, this has completely transformed my life. And one of the things we use are called touchstones. So they're ways of being together. And one of the touchstones, that wrote it down so I could get it correct. When the going gets rough, turn to wonder. Turn from reaction and judgment to wonder and compassionate inquiry. And it invites us to reflect on, what does this situation teach me about my own reactions and judgments? And again, that's a really interesting way to inquire into challenging circumstances or difficult symptoms, is to be curious about our own feelings and judgments about something.
Yeah. Wonder's a powerful word. I'm thinking of a chap over in the States, Jeffrey Davis, who I think his organisation, or certainly his podcast, is called Tracking Wonder. And I'm thinking about what you're saying there in terms of, there's so much to explore there in terms of what you were just saying, as you begin to track that wonder and what comes at you, what triggers you, to what you were saying a moment ago about the assumptions that we make, the judgments that we make, and exploring all that, but with a sense of wonder, and combining that with, I love that phrase and that reframe of threshold guardians, to think that the people holding the red tape, or those people that we feel get in our way or are causing us a problem, or perhaps even triggering us, are actually guardians of a threshold that if we can master, we can get across and find a larger version of ourselves, or take ourselves to that next level, if you want to put it in those sorts of terms.
Yeah.
So there's so much in just what you said there, Will. I think that's incredibly powerful. And I could see how there's so much that could be explored in that space, so much that could open up.
Yeah.
With that in mind, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was perhaps around language. And one of the things, I think it's really something I sensed quite early on in my life, is that how women were able to articulate themselves, particularly in the realm of feelings and emotions, and men less so. They perhaps had less vocabulary, or they even just struggled to structure something together to be able to even begin to talk about perhaps how they feel or what might be coming up for them if they're less appealing emotions. And I was just thinking a moment ago, when you were talking about the threshold guardians, and I was thinking about how you perhaps use poetry and art to access new ideas. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are in terms of language in relation to all of that as well, and whether that's a theme that you see, is getting almost stuck with the words, and how you manage that in terms of the work that you do, if that presents itself.
It definitely does. What's immediately popping up is the use of different forms of medium. So some folks might well resonate with a poem. Others may not, immediately at least. But another way of working, another technique or method that I have appreciated and love, and you can do it online, but it's powerful in person. Just print out a load of images and lay them on the table, and just invite somebody to select an image. Which image on this table is speaking to you? And it could be a picture of a boat. It could be a picture of a raven, or it could be a picture of a dog. And what I trust in that process is that there's something within us that just knows it's the dog. That's the image for me. So it transcends language, and it gets us into thinking more imagistically. And then we can have an inquiry about, so what does that dog mean to you? Why did you select the dog? So that's one way of doing it. And I have to say, come back to story. The way that I've been taught to work with story comes from Martin Shaw's School of Myth. And the way that Martin teaches is that as he tells a story, it is full of images and it is full of encounters. And the question he always asks is simply this: where do you find yourself in this story? You don't have to explain it. In fact, don't try and explain it, because the minute we try and explain it, the energy of the image, we can lose it. But I remember distinctly we were telling the story of I and John with a group of men last November. And there's an image of a hunter and his dog come into this kingdom. And he goes up to the king. There's been trouble in the kingdom. People go into the forest and they don't come out. And this hunter says, I'm looking for some action. Is there any action around here? And the king says, well, now that you mention it, there is some kind of action. And he sends him off into the forest. And this man, this hunter and his dog, they drain the swamp and discover I and John at the bottom of this swamp. And then the man and the dog disappear from the story. And when we invited the group to say, where are you in this story? Where did you find yourself? One guy just said, I want to know where the man and his dog's gone. And the funny thing is, later in that retreat, a dog that we didn't know came into the yurt. We subsequently found out whose dog it was, but it just came into the yurt uninvited. And you think that's a powerful image to go with.
That's fascinating. And I'm really grateful for that example because it brings to life some of what you're saying in terms of imagining ourselves in that story. But also, I think there was a reminder there for me that we don't have to figure it out. We don't have to come to a conclusion of exactly where we are in that story, and actually to even be able to relate to aspects of that story is a powerful thing in itself and can begin to open up perhaps ideas, the dialogue, whatever else it is that we need in terms of this exploration, which kind of comes back to what you were saying earlier about the deep self. And you mentioned inner truth as well. And I'm curious as to, particularly with the groups of men, how that works. And I'm curious to what it is that you find powerful about working in groups towards perhaps accessing that deeper self and perhaps our inner truth at an individual level.
I think, what do I love about working with groups? There's something about when we're invited to speak in a group, in a circle, we can hear little snippets of other people's story and we can start to feel, I guess, slightly less alone in it all. We can start to calibrate how we're feeling against how other people are feeling or what other people have experienced. And I suppose one of the really powerful things, I try not to use sort of broad brush gendered statements when it comes to working with men, but I think there are certain things that as a man I've had to speak out loud to a group of men that wouldn't have had the same effect if it had been either a mixed group. You know, I remember when I was thinking about going from a 5-day-a-week finance director role to part-time, and I thought, can I do that? Will people feel less of me if I'm working part-time as a man? And of course the answer's it's absolutely fine. Men can work part-time just as well as anybody else. But I needed to say that out loud to a group of men and to not be either shamed or ridiculed or questioned. And I suppose that's where a larger group could hold some of those larger questions that might be on our minds.
And just reflecting on that experience, which sounds like a really powerful one, what was it that you felt you gained from being able to open up like that in a group, and particularly a group of men? What did it offer you that you hadn't had before?
Validation, I think. Now, I've got this idea that sometimes we've got to go public with ourselves before we can go public in the outer world. And for many, many years, I don't think I had a safe, trustworthy community that I could go and do that with. I wouldn't have necessarily confided in some of my best male friends. So to have a trustworthy community where I can go and have a run at something, hear myself say it, maybe not quite agree with what I've just said about myself, and then reflect on it again. I think the benefit of community is really powerful. And it needs to be a special kind of community, which is why I love Circles of Trust, because it comes with the guidelines, if you like, of the touchstones, one of which I read before. They're beautiful. I've tried to pick holes of them and they still stack up.
Yeah, I was going to ask about guidelines in terms of that, because it sounds like a very special community, because I can imagine other communities, to your point there, best friends, groups of best friends, have plenty to say, plenty to judge, all well-intended most of the time, I'm sure. But I was curious about those guidelines in terms of the community, because it sounds like there's something special that's being held there in order to be able to provide you with that sense of trust so that you could speak so openly, for you then to be able to hear that for yourself, to then take it further wherever that goes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the touchstones that we use is no fixing, no helping, no saving, no advising. And the essence of that touchstone for me is that we have the answer within us, but we need a community to help us really trust our inner voice and our inner instinct, and our inner teacher is what we would say in Courage and Renewal language. We have the answers, but over the course of my life, I stopped trusting my inner voice, and it's taken me time to get back in touch with it.
Yeah, and that to me speaks to some of the themes that you were talking about earlier in terms of the inner self, that thread that you mentioned earlier, and that being perhaps one metaphor for that for me is that being our truth and reconnecting with our own sense of truth and being able to trust ourselves.
For sure. The thread is never let go of the thread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can imagine actually myself in a group similar to what you're describing there, and this need, this urge to want to fix or to offer somebody something. And actually that in itself could be quite a powerful practice, learning not to do that and almost to sort of stay in that place of just holding presence, but not actually having to fix or advise or guide or suggest.
Yeah. And I would say this applies for men and women, but in my experience with men, the minute you tell a group of men, you don't need to fix anything here. You don't need to save anybody. No one needs help.
Yeah.
They go, really? Oh, okay. I can be here more fully present in myself.
Yes. How interesting.
Knowing that there's no expectations of me fixing anything. Maybe I'll offer a particular kind of open question that might be of service to that particular person, but I'm not here to fix.
You mentioned a really interesting word there, Will, expectations. And I'm curious for you and whether this is something that you see come up a lot. Do you feel that a lot of men have quite wild expectations in terms of who they should be or who they ought to be? Or
I know I used to have wild expectations of who I should be. So I think that would be certainly true of myself. Societal demands, for sure. Expectations of always progressing in my career. That was quite exhausting towards the end. I never stayed in one role very long. I was always looking for the next big thing.
And what's given you the confidence to be able to let go of those expectations? What supported you along the way there? I'm sort of second guessing a little bit here that perhaps those opportunities to speak in groups out loud and hear your own voice has been part of the experience. But I'm curious what else might have been part of that journey for you in order to be able to perhaps let go of some of those really big expectations that I think some of us feel in life.
Yeah. What helped me to let go of some of that, the myth of progress, I suppose. What I'm coming back to is that idea from William Stafford that there was a thread that I was born with. And actually, that's what I've got to follow. The progress for me is to follow the journey that I was here to go on, whatever that journey is, which I'm still discovering. But that's as much progress as I think I need to make nowadays, is just to keep slowly moving along that journey and trusting that it will unfold in the way that it needs to. But I think being around other men who have also let go of the need to be constantly, I want to use the word competing, but I think it's almost competing against ourselves. When I grew up, I was an intensely competitive footballer. That competitive edge in me was at times pretty ugly. I didn't like myself sometimes. I was a bad loser at football. That I was deeply competitive, and I've had to let go of that now, or I'm happy to have let go of that competitive nature. It's not to say I'm not ambitious, but I think for me, there's a difference between being ambitious and being competitive, and knowing that there are men out there that I can trust to be around without having to impress them with my achievements. I think there's a lovely process that I learned through the centre, but that I've used with men is write your ego story, which is pretty much the CV. I'm Will, I'm a chartered accountant, I'm highly successful, all that. But now write your soul story. That's the story I want to hear. Tell me about your struggle. Tell me about when you messed up. Tell me when you've disappointed somebody. That's the soul story that I'd really love to hear. And there's not very many places that I can go to express that safely.
And I guess it's one of those things you were talking earlier about going public with it, but it's, I suppose, the inner work. Just because you're doing inner work here doesn't mean it can't be shared with a small trusted group of people in order to be able to evolve that inner work to a point where, not everything's going to go public, but maybe some things can go public that hadn't gone public before. I'm curious to the competitive nature that you mentioned there. I wouldn't say I'm a particularly competitive person myself. I certainly see it in a lot of my friends, in other men as well. I think you've partly answered the question I was about to ask in terms of how you've managed to soften that competitive edge, which sounds to me, the way it's coming across, has, you've managed to achieve in a very healthy way. The thing that really stood out for me that partly started to answer that question before I asked it was that this idea of the ego story and also the soul story. I love that because often I've never really thought about I've often thought about ourselves, what's our inner narration and what's the dialogue? What are we telling ourselves? But I've thought of that in singular terms. I think we're always telling ourselves a story. What's the story? But I've never quite thought of it in sort of more than a singular dynamic. So to think of it, what's the ego story here? And of course, we're coming back to what you were saying about multitudes. what's the ego story here? What's the soul story there? So I'm guessing that has perhaps allowed a level of self-awareness to come up. But I'm curious, what else has helped soften that competitive edge?
I think rumbling and coming to terms with my own failures, actually. When I got to a really senior role and realised that I didn't have the energy to do it, that's really humbling. It's an initiatory moment of you weren't as good as you thought you were. You weren't as capable as you thought you were. And I think being able to stay with that disappointment and that failure was what opened different doors for me in the end. I live my life through poems, but there's another poem that's coming to mind in the moment, which is a William Ayet poem. It's got a line in there saying, part of him hankers for business as usual. And I won't lie, there's a part of me that misses the cut and thrust of corporate life.
Yeah.
I've never, ever told any of my clients that they should quit their jobs and go and be a coach or run a restaurant or something. Because part of me loved that world, loved the adventure of it. There comes a point in life where you've got to, again, this is an idea from mythologist Martin Shaw, but to kind of acknowledge limit, to acknowledge that I can't do everything, but I can do something. And I think the realization as well that's coming to me in a moment is realizing that if I'm just a good dad to my kids, that's enough. That's enough.
Yeah.
And to show them what it means to teach them good lessons. Everything else might be a bonus, actually.
And to think of it that way around as well. Yeah, no, it's shifting the priorities is what I'm hearing there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the poetry and it's really powerful. In fact, it's quite curious. I've got a small translation, the T. Lawrence translation of Homer's Odyssey right up here on my wall. It's the only piece that's on that wall, curiously, and I do look at that as I set the intentions for my day. And I love what you've brought to our conversation today. There's just so many powerful access points, and I can clearly hear that poetry is one of those for you, which is really insightful and good to hear. So conscious of our time and your time, Will, there's so much we've covered. There's so much I'd love to just ask so much more about. But in closing, I think one of the things that I would be very eager to hear from you is, in terms of the work that you do with men, what you feel there is more needed of in the world right now. It's that sort of wave a magic wand type thing. What stresses and strains do you think could be relieved? And what was interesting to me, just reflecting very quickly on your own story that you shared with me just there, was for you, with all of what that perceived failure and that humbleness that you were talking about, what I was getting a sense of was rebirth and renewal.
Yeah.
So I've come away from our conversation today with those thoughts, as well as many other thoughts in mind, but how this is really actually these crunch points that we often arrive at are new beginnings and actually new opportunities. And I can't help but feel this sense of expansion that could come with all of that, which might sort of fit the solar system analogy mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Will, what you feel, what would we do well with more of in the world right now?
Yeah, for me, it comes back to that word trust. We need more trust in ourselves, trust in our inner voice, trust in our ability to make connection, trust our imagination, trust that rebirth is possible, even in difficult times. And not just possible, but that it is a force that wants to happen. Renewal and rebirth wants to happen. Nature teaches us that. So putting trust in the cycle of the seasons as well, I would say. That's another great metaphor that we haven't really spoken about, but get out there and trust the seasons and the cycles and be inspired by it. I would encourage people to be. But I think what we're lacking in the world is trust. Can we trust what we see on social media? Can we trust what's on the news? And to renew that trust, I think, comes from the inside out. It comes from our deep self out into the world. So I would say for me, that's trustworthy relationships builds courage, and courage enables us to renew and rebirth. And then it becomes a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, I love that. That's fabulous. Amazing. Thank you so much, Will.
Oh, no, it's been great. I've loved speaking to you about all this.
Is there anything that we haven't touched upon today that you feel needs to be said? We've covered a lot of ground, but I just wondered if there's any threads perhaps that you might have feel that might be worth sharing whilst we have the moment to do so.
No, I think I would just say again that, asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It could be one of the most courageous things we do, but it could be the start of a really incredible adventure, as difficult as it might be at the time. That's probably what I'd say. And I also firmly believe that there's something really important about men having trustworthy relationships with other men as well. There's something really nourishing about that, where we can hold each other gently accountable to show up with more wholeness and more integrity.
That's lovely. That's a perfect place to pause our chat today. So thank you so much for spending time with me this afternoon, Will. I've really enjoyed it, and I've made lots of notes here, which I'll be reflecting on after our chat. Our listener might be keen to connect with you and learn more about the work that you do, Will. So where's the best place for them to be able to connect with you?
Yes, thank you. So I've got a website, which is thewilljohnsonjourney.com. All of my social media links are on there as well. And I'm a fairly regular poster on LinkedIn as well, which is a good place to find me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, lovely.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And this might be a slightly personal question, but I'm curious professionally as well, what's next for you in terms of your own journey?
Do you know what? I think it feels like a great privilege to do this work, and I don't take it for granted. So if I'm still here in a year's time offering this kind of work, that will be enough. And if I had a bigger goal, it would just be to attract more men to come to one of our mythopoetic retreats, which we run in Suffolk. We run an annual retreat every November, which has been a slow growth. But if there's enough interest to run a second one at some point, that would be lovely as well. But really, it's just to keep gently developing this work. Thank you for the opportunity to share that. It's nice.
No, that's great. And yeah, it's that sense of enough that you talked about earlier there, which I really, really appreciate from our conversation today. And Suffolk not being too far away from me, I might be able to join you on one of those retreats. So that sounds great.
Yeah, you'll always be welcome.
Thanks ever so much for being on the podcast today.
Really wonderful. Well, thank you once again for the opportunity. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events for your continuing professional development.